chemtrails and the holy grails. Light on your Habsburg jaw, prove that you belong.
Nosferatu, Das Vidanya, Chimichanga, AFC, Noam Chomsky, LMNOP, welcome, Neophyte Remski-san.
Thank you, Joel. Thank you. I feel blessed. I feel cleansed. My chakras are clear. I'm ready to go.
Just open yourself. So
I'm open. I'm open.
I want to welcome.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Open, receptive. I'm ready. Thank you.
I want to welcome Matthew Remski of the podcast Conspirituality and the book Conspirituality. That's really good. I've always enjoyed him and the other contributors' work with that. They kind of look at the intersection of politics and pseudoscience and spirituality in a way that's really relevant. So we're lucky to have him here today, and I appreciate you joining us. I'm excited to kind of get into it and talk about some of the stuff out there that's going on in the world right now.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it too. Thanks so much for your invitation. And and I'm also always happy to talk to therapists because you are in the room and you're doing sort of very granular work with this material, and that's not often something that I get exposure to as somebody who does a lot of broad research and cultural tracking. So that's great.
It is a weird barometer, because you see these shifts happen pretty quickly. And one of the things that I talk about with my colleagues a lot is how it's almost like these generational differences have been smushed into like 2 and 5 year periods instead of 10-year cycles.
Yeah.
Like the difference in me and somebody 5 years younger than me and somebody 5 years different from them is so vast.
Yeah.
Especially just in the amount of hope that they have,
Right. Yeah.
Because they grew up with the internet reading this stuff and they don't really plan on there being an economic or ecological future for themselves,
Yeah, it's huge. Yeah, there's a cliff. They can see it fast approaching.
But that kind of nihilism, I think, is sad, and it's also kind of scary because you have people who essentially never even had the vision that there was a hope for the future, and then that was sort of in question. They just came into the world with the assumption that was never a reality.
Yeah, if I have the time and the wherewithal, and I get a contract that allows me to get out of this horrible news cycle, I think I would turn my attention primarily to that with regard to the issue of parenting, because I think that being able to not make despair transitive in familial relationships, to not make the anxiety of your own Gen X or millennial despair a single or central feature of your children's life is one of the most important challenges I think that I'm personally engaged with. So yeah. Great to talk to you.
Yeah. Not always fun stuff to talk about, but that's kind of where we try and go because, Trauma Therapy Podcast, the intersection of that and other realities in the world is that interest of mine. So, first, it's like, I know you have interviewed the directors of one of the documentaries on Twin Flames. There's 2 of them, which was one of those recent cults. And then there's all of these kind of mixtures of, it seems like multi-level marketing, that neuro-linguistic programming, post-Ericksonian hypnosis, motivational interviewing stuff, and basically the internet that has created these things, these kind of post-Nexium cults. That there seems to be a new documentary about mother cult, the god of the I forget what her name was, the cult of the mother god.
Yeah, Amy Carlson. Yeah.
Well, and the thing is, those things are fascinating because it seems like they're just increasingly low rent. I mean, when my wife was watching the Twin Flames documentary, and not at all to make fun of any of the people who are a victim of something like that, but she was like, it doesn't look like the people running this are trying very hard, and it doesn't look like the people who are in it are even believing very hard,
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about that. I mean, part of my, sort of personal story, which I might say a little bit more about later, is that, I was into high demand groups for about 6 years in my early 30s. And that's really kind of the backbone of my research interest going forward. And I think it's really the role that I play on the podcast, actually, is looking at the sociology of toxic spiritual groups. But it is a field that has become its own spectacle. And I think something strange is happening where it's becoming increasingly important to separate out two different things. And one is, what are the parameters and mechanisms of a cultic group? And what are our cultural fetishes around that group? You know, for people who are familiar with the incredible success of Nexium, not only as an organization, but also as an entertainment franchise now, because there are, you know, multiple big budget streaming documentaries out there. There's all kinds of reporting. I think it's worth reflecting on the fact that a lot of the people who came away from that group who ended up being central in its demise came from the entertainment industry.
Yeah.
And they, you know, that's not a problem in itself, but it does mean that there are incentives to turn the cultic experience into a cultural product that doesn't necessarily add to our sense of understanding or learning. And I think with regard to Nexium, the usage of cultic discourse, there's no doubt it was a cult. There's no doubt that Keith Raniere is a standard cult leader, but the way that some of these spectacles are now framed, for me, suggests that the term cult becomes an increasingly lazy and sensationalist term for like highly concentrated and localized capitalism. What ends up happening is that, you know, the more a monster Keith Raniere is, the less we really look carefully at Jeff Bezos. The more that the basic power relations of our economies are ignored, the more we can sort of invest and project all of its ugliness into a group. And you know, Keith really doesn't behave that differently from the typical billionaire CEO. And we have to understand that his entire sort of technique, his method, evolved out of the sort of the worst forms of predatory capitalism. And so there's a way in which I think cult commentary and documentaries at this point are doing the same kind of cultural labor that true crime and cop dramas do for the carceral state. Basically, we make people who are vulnerable to these groups into cultural jokes and people who are weirdos. I think that is very, very significant with regard to the Love Has Won cult. I think it also plays out in the Twin Flames universe. But really, I mean, we're talking about people in very marginalized, vulnerable circumstances whose tragic adventures in these groups probably would have been averted by better social services. And that's the conversation that we're not having, because we're talking about how evil cults are.
Yeah, you hit on two of my kind of softer questions already there, which was that one, you know, you think that there's pros and cons to giving this the true crime treatment. And I think, from my perspective, when it ignores these larger realities of capitalism to look for a boogeyman and then say, oh, look, here's this weird guy, so direct your anger at him, that isn't as useful as the ones that, like, I think Cult of the Amy Carlson documentary did a good job at showing that if these people had had access to healthcare, that cult probably never would have happened. That so much of it was her seeing this need and being like, well, I'm going to identify actual problems with that system to critique it. And the answer is that you need to turn blue drinking colloidal silver. You know?
Well, and you expand that or extrapolate it out to the level of QAnon, and the same dynamics are at play, where this becomes a demographic that is more stigmatized than understood. And that just doesn't work. It doesn't, and I think it fits very sort of cleanly into the smug condescension that, you know, is characterized by Hillary Clinton talking about a basket of deplorables, right? Like, there's no, obviously the ideologies, the memes, the harassment, the shit posting of QAnon is odious and it's harmful. But the broad sections of immiserated lower middle class and working class people in Rust Belt territory that get drawn into it, often when they are out of work, often when they're injured, sometimes when they are, trying to wean themselves off of OxyContin.
Mhm.
It's like this is this is this is symptomatic. QAnon is symptomatic. It is
Yeah.
not. It is not a sin. It's not a series of bad choices.
Mhm.
There's a lot about it that makes sense in terms of how it attempts to bind people together that have lost other forms of sociality.
Well, and I think the people who probably agree with the political outcomes that I would want, but I disagree with their method, that's what they're doing, is they're trying to use shame as this tool politically,
Yeah.
which I just don't think ever works.
It never
My
works.
point is, even if you're saying that you want what you want, you realize that doing it the way you're trying to do it, you're going to get the other result inevitably. I mean, there's certain inevitabilities. One, the question that I'd emailed you ahead of time, in the 70s in the US, you've got a lot of economic malaise. Carter goes up and tries to offer another myth, essentially, for what America is,
Yeah.
to replace the one that's failing with the crisis of confidence speech. And that's completely unsuccessful. People are angry. And you get this interest in mysticism and esotericism, which my theory is because you see this in every other empire when its star starts to wane. You get Mithraic cults as part of in the army, basically, of Rome. When the empire is no longer reflecting the ego of the individual, then I get this ego dissonance, or I get this cognitive dissonance where I'm like, I need power, and my empire's not doing it, and my football team's not doing it, and my army's not doing it. So I must go inward now and find a personal power, an esoteric power. And we always joke about how it was just so easy in the 70s to start like a cult that you could just wear an orange bed sheet and say kindergartner facts about like eating healthy, and got some guy a flower in the airport, and they're like, dude, do you have any metaphysical beliefs to go along with this flower? Like, thank you so much,
Right.
And but I think that was due to basically the economy and the oil embargo and all of those things. And so I think we're seeing that again now as people sort of lose faith, left or right. People feel like the government doesn't reflect their interests. They feel like they lost. And so, QAnon is essentially a conspiracy theory about how even though you didn't get what you wanted, or the guy you wanted isn't really in charge, actually, he secretly is underneath the surface. So you can still feel like you were right, or that you were powerful.
Yeah. And that you're going to get retribution.
Yeah. That you're going to have justice, and that you're not powerless.
Let me just go back to one thing. I have a lot to say about the emergence of magic, or the cycles of magic, but just to pick up on what you were saying about shame, I think, because I agree with Jeff Charlotte that fascism is actually a very appropriate framework for the kinds of anti-politics that we see emerging on the right wing in the United States. There's a sense, not that we're talking about policy, not that we are, really debating the common good, but that we are playing with spectacles of power and affect. And, this is why Trump is just not really a politician in that sense, right? He's an entertainer, and as somebody who is playing primarily on affect and power, to counterpose that with shame, to dig into the emotional, speculation of the souls of the people who are already activated in this very primal way, it just cannot work. It cannot work. And so it's not like I believe that reflective listening and everybody having individual therapy is going to change the course of the country, but I don't think that furthering the discourse, the polarizing discourse of stigmatization, is going to really help in any way. But as far as magic goes, like, the way I think about this rhythm that you're talking about, of the emergence of magical thinking or mysticism during times of economic and political stress, The person who I think summarizes this best in the sort of microcosm that we study, which is, what's happened between 1960 and 2020, and then the pandemic kind of like blows everything up or amplifies any of all of that. The guy's name is Sam Binkley, and he's got a book called Getting Loose. It's from 2004, and he starts by talking about like, all right, so in the 50s we have this contracted sort of repressive Fordism that the boomers basically are born into and grow up in. They go through a huge, expansive project of potential social change in the 60s, and that actually fails in many ways, bringing upon the contraction of the 1970s self-project and then the 1980s as the monetization of the self-project. And so I actually have a quote from him that I think that it's like is so pertinent. He says that by the early 1970s, it was clear that sweeping social changes were not going to materialize. A whole generation's trust in leadership had virtually collapsed, and the sense of national integrity and purpose had been shaken to the core. Not surprisingly, the national mood turned inward. People wanted to restore some semblance of normalcy to their lives after a decade of wrenching change. For the more persistent among this pioneering culture, the agenda shifted from transforming society to finding new ways of living at the grassroots level of society. Instead of continuing the seemingly fruitless struggle to change dominant institutions, many among this forerunner group began to concentrate on their immediate lives, the domain where they had genuine control and could make a visible, if seemingly small, difference. At the local level, countless small experiments in living began to flourish. Now, we take that analysis and say it is embodied by the yoga and wellness world's drive to depoliticize its demographic, very consistently over 20, 30 years, to say, political engagement is actually too abstract. It's useless. It's conflictual. It doesn't accord with your higher truth. What magic is what happens when, or what emerges as an answer. The self project emerges as kind of like the fallback, default project of this melancholy that says, it didn't really work, or it was too painful, or we lost too much, or we can't actually believe that we couldn't end the Vietnam War.
Yeah, the methods of getting what we wanted, we have to still pretend that they're effective instead of changing what we think effectiveness is or effective action is.
Yeah, right.
Well, and I get a lot of crap from self-appointed like Jungian experts and clinical psychology students every time I talk about that relationship. Like I'm saying that there's a spiritual cycle to, Chinese calendar of politics or something. But to me, it's basic psychology. I mean, the microcosm is the macrocosm. Like, what happened? Who's going to get into D&D and religion and comparative religion and Joseph Campbell in the high school? It's the nerd that can't get on the football team that's getting thrown in a locker that can go down in the basement and play D&D,
Yeah.
And there's this relationship to the external self and the internal self. And when we're pathways to this external kind of actualization are cut off, we move inward. And I don't think there's a way around that in psychology if you're going to be honest,
Well, what happens too economically is that as soon as the self project becomes a focal point of 1970s economy, deregulation and offshoring of labor strips away significant portions of that material world so that nobody can actually return to it. And so, what you have is scads of people who are now invested in the self project of getting loose, of becoming sort of more self-aware, more cognizant, more organic, more in touch with the earth.
Turn in, tune on, drop out.
Yeah, they're doing all of that, and meanwhile, the labor that actually makes their shoes, their earth shoes, is being offshored to Bangladesh. And so what is left for that demographic except to monetize the lifestyle? They can't monetize the manufacturing of the actual material necessities of life, because that's either becoming automated or offshored. Yeah. And so it makes sense. There's this like cycle of reinforcing factors where people sort of get funneled into almost a world that just sort of increasingly becomes less and less real.
Well, and one of the points that Adam Curtis brings up, and if you can even call it a point, those are so loose, but he says in All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace that there's this attempt at, communism, essentially, that these communities want equality, and so they splinter off, and there's these, groups, but that we're so predisposed to hegemony that what happens by the 80s, I mean, what you're saying is a financial and manufacturing point that's material and true, but another psychological component is that charismatic leaders rose up and took control of every single one of those, kind of idyllic communities and turned them into cults, essentially. That the idea of everybody was going to be completely equal was something that wasn't. Yeah. That is happening internally in those cults at the same time that you're making the material dialectic kind of argument about finance, which is also true. But
yeah, I guess if you have a self project emerge as a dominant economy in capitalism, it's got to evolve so that somebody's on top, right? Yeah. Somebody's going to be the leader.
You can take the hippies out of the capitalism, but you couldn't take the capitalism out of the hippies.
Yeah, I agree.
And you get back to the landers, which is its own weird thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember, I was born in 87, so in the 90s, I remember the internet was being written about a ton before it actually arrived, which I think is a huge part of how we got to where we got now. And it was funny because it was the news was basically I think the news was still news at that point, but it was still trying to monetize things. Yeah. And it seemed like as a kid, its point was to terrify housewives. They were always telling you that this new big thing was coming and it was going to get your kids. And so most of the coverage on the internet was that, but there was all this talk about how it was going to be this great thing that changed the world. And, I remember in the real early days of chat and things, the kind of libertarian type people would talk about the internet's going to remove all political problems because what will happen is you can log on and get the truth and the government can't control the truth. And so when you have the truth, you'll be able to vote right and overcome all of these things. And it was this very utopian, over the hill, the sun is rising. But what actually happened from where I was sitting was that what the internet let you do is have a million data points to justify anything you wanted to believe. What was being left out of that was this assumption that we want to change our beliefs, which is usually we want to justify our beliefs. And we're kind of our psychology is designed to stop us from wanting to change, not to be evolving. And so now you've got the ability to sit there and say, I want to believe the earth is flat, type. Okay, here's 500 reasons why I'm right. And that's sort of why everyone dug into their corner, and there's 800 million corners.
Yeah, and it's not just digging in or not changing. It's that the internet does seem to be in a really effective machine for actually amplifying and exaggerating beliefs that are already sort of well established or psychologically necessary. Mm-hmm. The first high demand group that I got lured into was run by a guy named Michael Roach. He's still out there. You can look him up on Instagram. He's still doing his kind of prosperity gospel, Tibetan Buddhism BS. And it's about let's see, what's the year? It's got to be 1997, 1998 or something like that. And one of the first things that I heard him say, or in that first year, he was starting to move into an application of Tibetan philosophy and its various, Buddhist theories of emptiness, or sort of the no inherent meaning of any material object or data point, and therefore, we really have to examine how we're putting together reality from our behaviors. So it's a version of non-dualism that's very ornate and beautiful, and it has a lot of grace to it, but what he wanted to do was he wanted to sell that as a spiritual path to Chinese oligarchs who at the same time were depopulating Tibet or colonizing it. Very, very weird. But I remember him standing up at one point and saying almost like a child, well, the internet just came along and it added $100 billion of wealth to the world instantly. And I remember thinking what what are you talking about? That there's it created a new world?
Yeah.
That it created something more than what is materially actually present. But it's so my point in bringing it up is that for the demographic that we study, the internet is not only a kind of warehouse of every possible data point that you can use in your, melted epistemology. It's also a place where its infinite structure mirrors the aspiration of both New Age philosophy and its endless growth, and late stage capitalism and its lack of limitation. Right? It's like there's no natural limit to anything spatially or epistemologically on the internet, and so there's this mechanism that we have that is based on a complete absence of guardrails or boundaries. It's a technology for creating literally infinite space. I mean, I watch my son play Minecraft, and the program is literally, as he zooms out forward, the program is literally building the landscape in the horizon, and it will go on infinitely. There's no end to the number of blocks you can use. There's only computing power, right? The only thing that's really like sort of creating a limit on how large your Minecraft world can be is your crunching power. And so there's this infinite growth technology that mirrors these beliefs that the mind is an infinite resource or the self can infinitely grow. It's all frictionless. It took away the notion of identifying charisma versus expertise as being some sort of pole star for whether you're going to give anybody credibility.
That is a phenomenal point. I remember when I first heard there are a couple guys that you guys have talked about, and I was saying, like, to my wife, like, these guys talk like J.J. Abrams movies. Like, there's so much momentum that it's so engaging, but then you back up and you're like, wait, this doesn't make any. Why would you have put the people in the torpedo tubes in Star Trek 2 if you were going to shoot them at it doesn't work. But the whole time you're listening to it, you're like, well, this thing connects to the next thing, and nothing holds together. But there is a charisma that I think people assume, and of course, it doesn't help if you're, kind of a moron that also happens to have a PhD or something, so people think that you're an expert. But there is this thing where we do mistake charisma for expertise.
Yeah. Well, and there's no there's no way of really defining it except through exposure. Like, charisma is defined post hoc, right? It's like, did this go viral? Well, you can sort of try to reverse engineer why it went viral, but you can't really get to the bottom of why do some people throw up when they hear Tony Robbins' voice, and why do some people feel like they should go and spend $5,000 to walk on fire next to him. Like, there is no real answer to that question. And the demographic that we study in Conspirituality counterposes itself against the world of institutions and expertise through the mobilization of charisma and charisma alone. Because we're talking about unregulated industries, which are unregulated in the same sort of historical political vein that the rest of the neoliberal economy took, because they are unregulated, there's no way of measuring the effectiveness of, like, the best chiropractor or the best Reiki practitioner. It has to be how the person performs. It has to be how the person presents themselves to the public. There's nothing else going on. And the way in which that intersects with how somebody like Trump comes to political power is almost a perfect overlay, because he's not doing politics in the same way that the wellness influencer is not doing science or medicine. They're doing performances of wellness. He's doing the performance of political power. And that seems to be enough. That's moving this, this economy, this $100 billion that instantly appeared, according to Michael Roach.
Well, no, and that's my question for the people that I've never really had any of them answer, but the people who share you guys' critique, my critique of these industries, the spiritual, influencer space, but they don't want to look at the market. They don't want to critique that. Like y'all had an episode on Conspirituality about coaches coaching coaches, where all these people went in and became influencer coaches. And so now there's enough of them that you can be like, I'm the coach who coaches you, because everyone became a coach, and it's, but my question is, like, when you get rid of for the people who say, okay, that's bad, but also just roll up your bootstraps and don't do it. Well, when everybody who's coming up and looking for work, increasingly can't afford college, you've moved all the manufacturing overseas, we don't make anything.
Yeah.
The entire economy is food service and gig work, essentially, where you do more damage and spend more gas on your car, driving around with Uber than you get paid.
Yeah.
And if you stay in food service long enough, you need Adderall and cocaine a lot of the time to keep up with the demands of the industry. Now you've got this addiction or health problems, or it's just not sustainable all the time. But nothing is manufactured. The only other thing out there is content creator influencer. How do you expect all these people not to be jumping into that space and, without another option? I don't see a way where that goes away unless something changes at the bottom level. But there's a lot of people who feel like we can just do it through gumption or diligence or some sort of empty language-based value.
Well, one thing that I would say is that any kind of political movement that began to reconsider the invisibility and the unpaid nature of care work would be a first start, right? Yeah. Because regardless of whether or not there are Ford factories rolling trucks off of the line in Detroit anymore, there's going to be people, usually women, staying at home, taking care of elderly people with disabilities and children. Mm-hmm. And it's like, so whether you are not making anything and you've become a content influencer, or you still have the opportunity to make something, the care work is still there. Mm-hmm. And to make that more visible and to make it paid, perhaps through, I don't know, UBI has a bunch of problems with it, but with something that acknowledged the fact that work is going on, even in this strangely sort of depersonalized and dissociative world, then that would be really good. And I guess the other thing that I would say is that, relearning how to do good things in the world is actually a really good thing, and unfortunately it has been taken up primarily by a kind of reactionary political aesthetic that says I'm going to organic farm, or I'm going to learn to wild harvest, or I'm going to, figure out how to provide for my local community. And so something has to happen there where the drive to do that should be socialized into networks of solidarity, so that the people who are doing that as influencers, and they're doing quite well at it, somehow realize that it doesn't really help anybody except perhaps themselves through their royalty checks to sort of promote or to advertise a form of life that the vast majority of people don't have access to. So I am, like, a really good example of this is RFK Jr. is proposing that the opioid crisis, that various addiction issues that statistically seem to be on the rise. I don't know whether he's got those facts right or not. He usually gets most things wrong. But I mean, let's just say that there's a lot of people who are underserved by addiction services and mental health services. We know that. So he's talking about modeling a countrywide country or rural retreat organic farm network where kids, teenagers could go to work for 4 years learning how to farm and work in a woodwork, and they wouldn't have phones, they wouldn't have their devices, they wouldn't have internet access, and I mean, to be honest, it's like, you can see where the appeal comes from in a world in which very few people are able to touch grass. But when that the logic behind that is pretty much eco-fascist and ableist, that it's not going to have the desired outcome, or it's not going to have a good systemic outcome. And I think that's why Naomi Klein's analyses are so important, because I find myself listening to RFK Jr. on this kind of organic reparation camp idea, and I'm going, yeah, I think that sounds like a really good idea, and I really don't want him running it. Then I realized that it's not something that I, as a policymaker, would bring up or press for, because that guy's already talked about it. And what Klein is saying is that whenever we have these, reactionary forces take up reasonable critiques of the neoliberal order, they make sense to a huge portion of the population, but because people who are more attuned to the facts feel poisoned by their involvement with those issues, we don't actually take them up ourselves. And so, I think that the general idea of figuring out how to, I could be part of an abolitionist program, right? To get rid of prisons and to create farms, but you would have to make sure that it was some of the fundamental assumptions of how people are served are really well studied. And I don't think RFK Jr. really has anything helpful to say about that.
Well, I remember when I was in college, it was kind of the end of libertarians. There would be these people, because there's not really a lot left. There would be these people that wore a backwards baseball cap and had long hair and listened to Radiohead, and they'd put up the Ron Paul poster, and they were really into Ron Paul. But I remember that there was a contingent of just kind of normal moderate Democrats that were we should vote for Ron Paul because he has ideas that are pretty good that might happen, and then ideas that are so batshit crazy they'll never happen.
Right.
And so it was a strategic thing that they were trying to do, by hoping that those ideas would get weeded out.
Right. Right.
But the way that when you're talking about all of these cults and most of the reactionary political movements that you're talking about begin with a critique of the system as it exists, politics, the neoliberal order, healthcare, that is right.
Yeah.
It's just that the answer is not snake oil because there's corruption over here. And I mean, that's one of the things that I wish, it would be interesting to me if y'all got into more on conspirituality, is a lot of times the episodes end with this is pseudoscience and this is science. Well, I'm a licensed social worker. I'm doing evidence-based practice in Alabama. We're also trying to innovate, because a lot of the things that have been around forever, like cognitive behavioral therapy, I don't feel like are very helpful for trauma. We need more kind of brain-based medicine that changes the subbrain. There's, 20 competing technologies and QEEG and neuromodulation with different pros and cons, all these things. So I'm on the, science part of it, but in that system, I still see a ton of problems with what we allow to happen, and so I think there was very unscientific things about the way we use research, for example, the people with the PhDs.
For sure. And I'd just like to point out that whenever we have a denouement on the show that is, okay, well, we've separated the truth from the falsehood here, and on we go. I share some of your dissatisfaction with that. And I think that's partly because I'm not being a scientist. I'm not the scientific analyst on the show. I don't do science journalism. I don't think it's as satisfying as for me to make those distinctions. I think they're very important to make, but I also sometimes we get into the territory of suggesting that, if everybody just came to a clear understanding of the capital S science, we would all be okay. And I just think that that's patently untrue. I'm not saying that we are saying that, my colleagues are saying that, but I think it can leave some people with the impression. And to your point, the pseudoscience and the conspiracy theories that we study, they come from real events, they come from real needs. To reference Naomi Klein again, conspiracy theorists get the feelings right and then they get the facts wrong. And I would say additionally that conspiracy theorists are empathetic because they can feel systemic problems acutely. Like they know that healthcare can be tone deaf, neglectful, traumatizing, that its profit model can be predatory. They know that governments lie. They know that the CIA overthrows foreign governments. They
The
know
lady on the
Yeah.
January 6th protests telling the reporter, I'm here sieging the Capitol because my son has autism and we don't have health care, and they have the cure for that in there. I mean, it was heartbreaking. I mean,
Incredible
that's the
stuff.
saddest thing.
I have a lot to say about that too, because autism, I think, is like profoundly interesting as a flashpoint for why so much of this has happened, because it has to do with imputed values or skills in parenting, and then also just the mystery of who the child is amidst a capitalistic structure that needs it to go into production, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, but I would say, like, conspiracy theorists also know that Jeffrey Epstein abused girls and young women in order to manipulate political power. They know that he ultimately got away with it. They're correct that the Catholic Church has been, revealed in part to be like a global sex trafficking organization that shuffles around priests and does whatever it can to limit liability. They're not wrong.
Sometimes.
Right. They're not wrong about surveillance capitalism. They're not wrong that the response. They're just not wrong about what the general structures are, but the responses they come up with are going to be scrambled, because they often don't have access to the data or the structures of learning that they need. They're not going to get their answers or justice from yoga gurus or anti-vax salesmen.
When the train blows up in Palestine, Ohio, and their solution is not to mobilize an effort to contain this thing federally and treat it, it's to just, for some reason, light tons of polyvinyl chloride on fire and turn a whole town black. And the Obama, the left leaning guy, is the one who repealed all these rules on the brakes for the trains, and Trump is sitting in office. Do you need like a chemtrail conspiracy about why the government is using the planes to secretly do it at that point?
I think what you need, I think the thing is that there's a direct relationship between the chemtrail conspiracy as something that you can create versus the Palestine disaster, which has been created and is being denied or suppressed, right? Like, I think this is essential to the heart of the satanic panic as well. We know childhood sexual abuse is a thing. We know that it happens domestically. We know that it's been covered up. We know that there are power dynamics involved in how it occurs. What happens over years, over generations, when you say, nope, we're not going to listen. Nope, it's too difficult to report this out journalistically. Nope, you don't have enough sources. Nope, because you don't remember the color of the shirt your perpetrator was wearing when you were 6 years old. You're not a credible narrator. When you can't, when it's so difficult to find redress through journalism or law, why wouldn't the desperate person begin to get louder? Why wouldn't the desperate person be forced into a position in which they might want to do things that would become more visible, or why wouldn't they be paranoid that everybody is actually trying to suppress the problem of pedophilia? Why wouldn't they begin to let their imaginations provide them some, sort of relief in terms of understanding where they are?
Well, you had talked a little bit about your history, and I don't want to make you repeat everything that you've said on your show, but could you give people a little bit of context of kind of your arc as a scholar and a person, how your epistemological hygiene, changed or was informed over time?
Yeah, I mean, I was in two high demand groups. I'm glad that you note that I don't want to make you repeat things, because there is like there is a relationship between recitation and reification, right? Like the more you tell, a particular story about how you got somewhere, the more social capital it can build up. And I've noticed that around, I used to use the word cult survivor, and I think that's still a valid term, but I realized that when I used it, it made people very, very sort of like tentative to ask me challenging questions, or to say, how were you vulnerable? How did you get yourself into that situation, and why didn't you leave? And I think those are valid questions to ask as well. So anyway, I used to teach yoga. I founded and I co-ran 2 yoga studios. I was a community organizer here in Toronto for yoga people, as far as that went. That wasn't much, though. It wasn't like political organizing. I did that in my prior life. But I became a journalist really out of the recovery process of figuring out what had happened, gathering analytical frameworks for why my particular experiences were not surprising, how they functioned. It was like a breath of fresh air to come across cult theory that said, oh, well, the way that Michael Roach did the thing that he did was through X, Y, and Z. That was really helpful. But I've since, really taken a much more politically left and historical materialist lens around why cults form and why they explode during the 1970s, why they harden and become much more
and are exploding now.
And are exploding now, why they become much more highly lucrative in the 1980s. And so, yeah, I've really come to see that the post 1980s global expansion of conspirituality, it has been amplified by yoga and Buddhist and wellness high demand groups, but it's also inseparable from the breakdown of local economies, stable labor markets, plus the rise of gig work, as you were referring to. And then all of these things are amplified by social media fragmentation and, just a growing awareness of neoliberal neglect and cruelty. And I've come through this podcast project to really believe that Conspirituality and QAnon in particular are, it makes sense that these are primarily American phenomena. Yeah. Because they would not have exploded to the extent that they did, especially in the U.S., if there wasn't already embedded, or it didn't come on top of a centuries-long history of white Christian nationalism, and then also a population that just was not cared for by functional government, by labor protections or universal health care.
Well, so based on pretty American assumptions about self and identity and freedom, and
yeah.
I wonder, do you feel like, you talked a little bit about the relationship between cults and fascism. I mean, one way I see that connection is that it seems like they both, I mean, there is a lefty political neurosis too. I mean, I'm not letting anybody off the hook. There's also a moderate. I mean, I think the lefty one is that you identify with the victim so much that it's not really empathy. You're just saying, I can't change and nothing's my fault. So also nothing is his fault and he can't change, which is not, effective. And then there's that kind of avoidant moderate, political neurosis of like, no, whenever there's 2 people fighting, I don't want to pick a side. It's just that both bad ideas are a little bit right. The truth's always in the middle of 2 bad things. And that comes from like, I don't want to hold authority, whatever. But, I think the right-wing political neurosis is like this thing of, I was raised, don't cry, I'll give you something to cry about. I either don't want to own my own trauma or admit that it was damaging. I despise my own vulnerability. So I project and attack that vulnerability externally. So when you're telling me, well, this little group of people, they're gay or black or whatever. No, the free market wants them to hurt, or God wants them to, I'm angry at a part of myself that I don't like. And so I'm going to take it out on you. When somebody says, well, we're bombing 13 countries you can't name. No, that's for freedom. That's good. That's not a foreign policy point. It's an emotional reaction,
Yeah, right.
And what it seems like from, Max Ehrhard to Rainier to any of these people, what they're doing is essentially right wing, and that it's saying, hey, everything is your fault, mind over matter, whatever happens to you, every time you get hurt, you're the reason. There's no victimhood. You're the reason that you're hurting. So disown all the parts of yourself and all the things that can recognize these red flags, and realize that all your suffering is ultimately your own doing. So I'm not abusing you. And then once you are in that kind of dissociation, essentially, or numbness, there is no sense of self. There is no identity. And that's what a lot of people seem to be calling brainwashing. I mean, where is that right, wrong? Like, what do you think?
What I'm thinking, I mean, I've sort of been on this theme already today, but as I'm listening to you describe the basic narcissistic orientation of these groups and movements, I'm just sort of in awe of how deftly, and I think this happens unconsciously. There's this thing about how one of the transcribers of A Course in Miracles worked for MK Ultra, and so some people have, indulged this fantasy that the self-blame, victim-blaming architecture of texts like A Course in Miracles are actually like a government plot to desocialize or to destroy alliances and things like that. I don't think it happens like that at all. It seems that it's
Jonathan Safran Siegel or whatever that book was, reporting to the the CIA headquarters. Is he flying back to Langley?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Because or was yoga a psyop? That was actually invited in by the Indian Immigration Act of 1968 or whenever it was, where it's like, oh yeah, if we bring all of these gurus in to teach yoga in the local storefronts, then people will stop going to protests. Like that did happen. I just don't think it was planned.
It was convenient. There was an ex-agent who was talking about the Epstein thing and the history of the CIA with child trafficking and whatever, and he was like, it's pretty easy to go into a country that is a banana republic that's starting to use its resources for itself to help its people, and then overthrow that government with the military so that you can, and make it look like an accident or a natural thing so that we can extract all those resources and have them cheaper and they don't stay in that country. It's like, that's pretty easy to do. But if you look at these conspiracy theories, when there's huge, vast networks and a lot of failure points, and it went off flawlessly, the CIA didn't do it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that what is so tender and tragic is that so many of the spiritualities that we study on the podcast, they emerge as, I don't know, it seems that they emerge in part as a way of people trying to feel better about the demands and the logics of late capitalism, right? Because they don't actually challenge the fetish for productivity. They don't challenge the relentless attack on workers' rights. They don't challenge the basic kind of self-centered principle of, wealth accumulation. There's nothing about the yoga or the Buddhism or the Course in Miracles materials that I studied that encouraged me to be a social actor. Mm-hmm. In fact, what it did, and this is going back to Binkley a little bit, is that it made me feel better about the fact that it feels really bad to be a social actor, and that what's actually what gives more relief, what gives more pleasure, is to shrink your world down into the sort of pristine function of your own, digestive system, or the moment by moment weather in your mind, and if you can sort that out, then you have some sense of agency. It's really an abdication of a greater, of a greater possibility. And yeah, are cults right wing, or do they tend toward in that direction? Yeah, ideologically. Well, no. Let me say this: ideologically, there can be some confusions because there are left-wing cults. There are Marxist cults. There are workers' union cults for sure. But one very helpful axiom from cult theory is that the content doesn't really matter. Because the mechanics are really the same, and the mechanics move structurally towards right-wing sensibilities, conspiracy theories, and authoritarianism.
A lot of people said that about Nexium, was that the ideology kind of changed overnight when he came out with that like man's and women's course, the role of the society, that it went in this totally different direction really quickly when that happened.
Yeah, I haven't heard that commentary. I think that one thing that's at play is that maybe it was one of these breaking points where, or it was a content shift based upon his own sort of magpie insatiability for new content, right? Like what's going to be saleable in this pyramid structure that I already have, and if I can build it into my own sexual ethics and behaviors, and talk about how, well, all women really want is this, and all men should be like that, and that's all very au courant because neo tantra is on the rise at the same time. Then it just works out. But I don't know that he had a more progressive politics at any given time. I think
it was always the affectation of this is about self-love and openness and knowing the self. And then once you had a certain amount of buy-in to it, I think they all work like that, it looks like this big party on the outside and everybody's always talking to him on the stage saying like, oh, it was so much fun, thank you, that retreat was so great, in front of the new people who haven't been to the retreat yet, but I don't know, that it's funny, like I got in trouble, I had to pull it down because one of the programs with Taproot is that, like, the reason we do the podcast and the blog, other than like I'm super busy, I just spend all my time either at work or with my kids, and I get to talk to smart people, and I really get a lot out of that personally. But it's for SEO because that's the biggest expense for a business this size. You can write listicle garbage, pay for a content farm to do that, or you can do things that people actually engage with and reshare. And I do it because the project here is to find therapists who are talented and young and then empower them before the market will, and let them have more control and ownership over their practice than the market will give them. And so, your time, that's why this is so valuable. But so when an article gets really big, like the one that I had written critiquing BetterHelp or something, I'm always like excited, but I had to pull down one of our biggest things, which I won't say the name of the organization, because people were talking about this one high control group and they were like, why would anyone do this? People are so stupid, whatever. It made me mad because it felt like blaming the victim. And also the people who tend to not understand how those groups work are the same ones that get taken advantage of by them, So I wrote an article saying, like, these are how they all work. Like, I'm not saying, and I said in it, I'm not part of this organization and I don't have knowledge of this firsthand. I'm just telling you, this is what was behind the scenes because this is what they all do. So this is how they got in it. And people somehow missed that part. So people who had been in that group and left started sending me emails being like, hey, yeah, you were in that group. What floor were you on? And I was like, whoa, no, I wasn't. And then other people who were still in it thought that I was like a threat because there was some ongoing legal stuff against them. And they were like kind of coming after my business. And I was like, I don't want to be on the radar of a cult at all. Like, this is all off the internet. Don't worry about it. But it really struck a chord with the people who are in the organization, just kind of explaining the psychology of those groups in that way.
What I hope, because I've been doing cult journalism for maybe 2024, I would say like 8 years now. And what I would hope is that over time, the stakes, the rhetoric, the sensationalization or the sensationalism of the sort of cultic vibe just goes down. Toxic groups are not the exception, they're the rule. It's very difficult for us to organize ourselves in egalitarian and fair ways in capitalism. And the shame involved in recognizing your participation in a group that hits the markers of these traditional definitions of, dependence, dread of leaving, and deception, or, behavioral information, thought, emotion control, all of the sort of checkbox definitions that cult theory has given us from, very astute researchers. There's a way in which sort of identifying your participation in a group like that is a liberatory moment, but it's also an incredibly shameful moment.
Yeah.
And negotiating the passage from shame to a little bit more personal freedom and agency is really not helped by social media, and it's not helped for the most part by having your group's inner workings displayed by documentarians on Netflix.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And I would be curious, because you talked about you not being the science expert on conspirituality. So, I'm interested in things like mysticism, and that there's perennial philosophies that people in a vacuum come up with the same types of spirituality, which to me is telling us something about our unconscious. Things like yoga and Carl Jung and a lot of these mystical guys completely get misappropriated and butchered and have, they have these gross associations. But, the original stuff, I like some of that. I mean, could you speak a little bit to maybe that tension that we do have a objective brain that is scientific and logical, and a subjective brain that is mystical and emotional? And, how do we reconcile that tension, in the world? Well, how do you do that in your work?
Well, okay. So, I'll speak to how we kind of negotiate this territory in the podcast, because we have different perspectives on it, and then that'll say something about like how I personally do it. There is a strategy for speaking about pseudoscience that is kind of intersectional with how we speak about toxic beliefs or dysfunctional beliefs. And the thing is that one strategy we could describe as being atheistic, right? Where the drive is to sort of dispel illusion in all cases, and to treat pseudoscience and the belief structures of religious people as though they belonged to the same category. And I think that there can be a lot of value there, especially for people who are questioning their natal religious beliefs that they didn't consent to taking on. They can evaluate in a very kind of liberatory way the possibility that their yearnings actually have material bases, or that there's nobody watching over them in some kind of way that increases their paranoia instead of their wonderment in life. All of that, I think, can be very valuable. And then there's a way in which certain framings of mysticism and religious belief as being unnecessary or predictably toxic because they're going to lead to bad places, that in my estimation, and I differ from Julian and Derek in this way, in my estimation, that can go too far. Not because it's not technically true, not because it's not a reasonable argument, but because it's not an effective argument when you're speaking to a population that is never going to be atheistic, right? Like, I think the current stats, Pew has self-declared atheism in the United States at around like 4% or something like that. That is a tiny minority of people. And they should be protected. They should be honored. They should be allowed to put their funny statues in state legislatures in Indiana, right? That's all cool by me. But I think it is a mistake to take an overly rationalist approach to the relationship between religious sensibilities and mysticism and frameworks, and pseudoscience or religious extremism. I think the causal pathway between religious sensibility and negative political outcomes is very uncertain. Obviously, it is toxic in political conflicts around the world. Obviously, there are forms of religious fundamentalism where super strong and toxic and aggressive beliefs are at the center of jihadism, religious Zionism, and then apocalyptic Christianity all boiling over in Israel at the moment with this kind of zeal. Yes, all of those things have to be reckoned with, but an attitude that takes that is incurious about, or that is skeptical towards the authenticity of people's religious experience when they say that religious experience is helping them understand the world in more empathetic and solidarity promoting ways, that's a mistake. I think that's a tactical error.
Yeah, that was kind of my question there.
I would say, and I haven't said this clearly before. I don't think I'd say it on our podcast, but I feel okay saying it here.
Not that it's not a great show and it doesn't work, but it's y'all are different people, and
we're different people.
That's where I noticed that they bump up against one another the most.
Totally. Yeah, that's where we really have. That's where we have our most difficult and our most
as a therapist
conflicts.
too that likes psychology and feels like it became a ton of damage that has not been got done to it in the 80s. It's when we came in and said everything is a number. We can understand everything empirically. Oh, CBT is the thing that works the best. Your only cognition and behavior.
And
when you're
guess
processing trauma, that isn't a part of your brain that does not understand time and does not understand language. I'm not a woo-woo spiritual out there, but it is energy. That is the word for it.
Yeah. Well, and the thing is that so all of that ramps up during the 1980s, and then guess what? We have a replication crisis.
Yeah.
So then we have to go back. Then I would just say that the area is I just would say that the area is contested and it should remain so. And I would say something like I believe that at this point self-identified progressive American Christians, even maybe even especially evangelicals, that the health of the American democracy is probably more in their hands at this point than in the hands of any other group, because they are the ones that have the language, the family connections, and the cultural connections that go deep into the red state psyche that has curdled over with a kind of paranoia. They are the ones who are able to effectively say, hey, Christian nationalism is a heresy. They are the ones who are able to say, hey, Jesus doesn't care about your crotch. And this is why. I'd
buy that T-shirt if you want to sell it.
Exactly. I mean, they are the ones who, like family members, can say, we share something here, and we're going to be persuasive with you. And that's not something that Lucien Greaves at the Satanic Temple. He can't do that. He's a showman. He's funny. But he can't do that. He has not.
He's a trickster. I mean,
he's a trickster, right?
He's a professional.
And he has not moved the needle, I would say, on he has not meaningfully moved the needle in terms of depolarization or political, I don't know, usefulness or generativity in any way. Right.
Well, but, I mean, from where I'm sitting, and again, some of the tension I hear on your show, and then see over the course of my life being educated and meeting the people in school and everything, is like, if you don't really understand what religion is, that it's this kind of mystical and emotional phenomenon that is it's a lens to help you make sense of the world, you will make something your religion. It will control you. It will get you if you don't understand that. And I think people who identify as atheists a lot of the time are the most susceptible to that. I mean, there were people made fun of me for a long time that I went to school with for looking at Carl Jung or being a comparative religion major and studying these things that were sort of as a soft science. Because why don't you just be an enlightened atheist and feel better than everybody and make jokes about this? And then what happened? All those people post college had a drug trip, and all of a
Right.
sudden are telling me, and then I died and there was nothing and there was the water and then the world came out of the water and it was reborn. And I'm like, you're telling me Genesis, like this is literally, and then they were like shocked. And I was like, no, the answer is not that you're supposed to go and join these religions, which is what they were kind of trying to do. You could. The point is that you just need to understand this isn't a thing separate from you that is other people. It has other people's number, but it doesn't have yours. That transcendental function is there. And if you don't own it, and I think, I don't know if you've read Edward Edinger, but a lot of that we have an existential self and a mystical self. I mean, what happens with the Ayn Rand people being super logical? Their religion becomes economics, essentially. Like you're using the wrong part of the brain for the wrong thing. You're taking a religious experience and making it literal, which that's kind of a weird thing to do. Or you're taking an economic system or, a secular system and turning it into a religion, which is kind of a weird thing to do.
I want to say something. Yeah, it does. I want to say something very specific and in defense too of my colleagues, so that I'm not misrepresenting.
I'm not attacking them.
I know, but I want to make sure that I'm not misrepresenting anything, which is
sure.
that neither of them would ignore or deny mystical experience or the reality of people going through transcendent sensations.
Mm-hmm.
There's no argument with that. And so they really, both of them express a kind of deep devotional mysticism.
Yeah.
Where the only place that the friction really emerges is whether or not we lean into a critique of people's origin story for how those mystical experiences emerge in the process of arguing about something else, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it comes up in terms of can a Catholic progressive be a credible analyst of or source for this particular political issue? How much do you have to agree with somebody in order for them to be an ally? That's really where the friction lies. And it's not even it doesn't even descend into rudeness, but when you don't you have to recognize where your biases and tendencies lie. And if you have the feeling that the person who is a devoted Catholic, for example, is going to be epistemologically or morally challenged in a bunch of different ways that make him incompatible as an ally, if you just have that general sense, you're probably not going to look carefully at what they say. You're probably not going to go seek them out journalistically as a source. And I think that can be a lost opportunity. But luckily, we are a diverse cast, and so I can do that. They don't have to. And it works out. Then we fight about it in Slack.
Yeah. Well, and I'm not at all trying to criticize your show. I mean, it's a successful thing, or any of the people on it. I just think that the diversity of perspective, the diversity of perspective is interesting. And when y'all have talked about that, it's been one of the things and that's important for epistemological hygiene.
Yeah, right.
To know what you're coming from. So, yeah, I think the secularization of watching the secularization of the evangelical church, especially the megachurch movement, because evangelical's a big net. You see that almost taking down some of those churches, their need to deconstruct it and control it. Almost the pandemic kind of bit them, because I remember one of my barometers for seeing if there's a cultural shift or whatever is did somebody write the same article in the Atlantic 6 times, basically, by different authors?
Right.
And the one that happened was during the pandemic, they kept being well, I think that this guy, he's a right-wing pastor of the megachurch, and he's for Trump, but his practitioners or his people are leaving the church and calling him a woke, libtard on Facebook. So, if that's happening, maybe the church is doing a bad job reaching out to people during the pandemic, or engaging the community or something. And to me, it was no, what happened was that the historical Jesus was already kind of not useful to you. You know, the things he did.
Yeah.
You know, so you took that out, and then, you know, because I went to a lot of different kinds of churches doing my comparative religion thing, and one of the things I was kind of shocked by was that, like, God doesn't really come up much. I mean, it was like a list, a call and response in these mega churches of like cultural grievance. I mean, seriously, I sat in one service that was like an hour and a half long, and they would just be like, well, this is on this reality TV show, but we don't like trans people, do we? Oh, no, we don't. Well, this person said a Muslim could get into heaven, but we know that's not true. Yeah. It's like,
wow.
I don't watch TV, man. Like, if it makes you this upset, just don't watch this. You know, but that was it. And so when the pandemic happened, you know, you take the historical Jesus out of it, and God is not, he's too mystical and weird. So what you do is you just use Jesus as a form of submission. Like when he came up in church, it was always like, but you've got to surrender to Jesus. You know, you're trying to be your own thing and fight yourself, but you've got to give in to Jesus. It really just meant dissolve your own identity and be a part of this thing, you know, is how they used it. And so during the pandemic, everyone's on Facebook and they're like, well, I can just do this myself. I can just LARP. I can connect the dots and know the rules. I'm writing my own sermon. I'm Glenn Beck with the chalkboard, and here's where the Soros money went. Why would I waste the gas to go to church? I can just eat at the Cheesecake Factory, you know, in my SUV whenever I want. Like,
yeah, you know, I want to ping here. I think Brad Onishi on Straight White American Jesus is probably one of the best analysts of this particular transition to the ascendancy of the suburban megachurch, which is basically audience captured. It's an entrepreneurial model, and then it bites everybody in the ass when the pastors sort of come around and they realize, oh, they have to repeat what their parishioners are hearing on Fox News, or else they're not going to get the tithe. And that's also why recently
because there's a monoculture. There's not a religious function and a government function anymore. There's this huge monoculture that you get to be part of, and you're either with it or against it. So it's not that I'm at church right now, I don't want to hear Fox News. It's that your church has to be Fox News or I'm not going to go.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and this is one of the reasons that I'm very interested in Catholic progressivism currently, because there's at least some semblance of central organization that everybody has to agree around. It's not sort of free for all. Every pulpit is going to be bought and paid for by the congregation. Mm-hmm. There's actually an existing institution with all of its sort of apathies and bureaucracies and possibilities, and there are people fighting over actual resources that everybody shares.
I'm not at all calling them gangs, but the comparison is kind of apt that, like, you know, there is a guy that's the head of the mafia or the head of MS-13, and you have to do what he says. But if you're a Crip or a Blood, like, that's just a sort of symbol and initiation ritual and aesthetic. But like there's no one telling the Crips in New York what to do from California. You know, and the evangelicals are kind of more the Crip Blood model, and the MS-13 mafia model is kind of more with that's the Pope, man. You know, he's the
and right now the Godfather is having lunch every Wednesday with a bunch of trans women from the poorest district in, you know, this town south of Rome. Like, it's a really interesting time. He's coming out with big long letters about how, you know, the environment has to be protected at all costs.
Have you ever looked at the Catholic Church's relationship with Carl Jung?
No, not really.
It's really weird. Like, well, at one point, Jung wrote the Pope a letter because he made Mary a saint or elevated her status somehow. And Jung was like, yeah, you're doing the religion so much better now because there has to be a female aspect. There's always a quaternity. So you're trying to do three, but you also kind of need the devil in there, and, like, you know, whatever. There's
he was cheering
parts
him on.
Of one and then one different, but there has to be a feminine. And the Pope's like, yeah, of course I'm doing Catholicism right on the Pope, dude. You know, you like probably rolls something up, you know, with the letter, you know. And then later somebody's like, hey, this psychologist, he's talking about religion, and a Pope writes like a blessing of Jung that he gets even though he didn't ask for it, and it's like, okay, thanks. And then another bishop gets angry 10 years later and writes another letter and says, this guy's saying archetypes and whatever. And then the Pope, like, sends him not an excommunication, but like a denunciation. So, you know, just this guy minding his own business, getting all this mail from the Catholic Church is kind of a funny thing.
That is funny. Yeah, that's wild.
I don't know. It's kind of an aside, but I always thought that was a overlooked episode of. Jung gets in a fight with Martin Buber at one point via mail, which I thought was funny too.
Yeah, the old flame wars.
Yeah. It is like forum posting.
Yeah, totally.
Well, this has been fascinating. I want to keep you past time. I know you've probably got other things to do.
Yeah.
I did invite the other members of Conspirituality on, so it wasn't like I was, saying your perspective was one I wanted to bless and not.
Yeah. Right.
Everyone's schedule's busy, and I sent Brad Anishi an email a while ago. I hadn't heard back from him, but we're kind of teeny tiny, and this is just kind of for fun. So.
Well, I really appreciate it, Joel. Great talk, great thoughts. Thank you for your questions and your thoughtfulness.
Is there anything that you would like to promote, like that you're working on, if people want to find your stuff and know anything more about what you're doing?
I can just say that, everything that we've got going on is at conspirituality.net, including there's a link to our book, which I think is pretty good. And I'm just interested in I'm personally interested in hearing from people in that, progressive institutional religion zone. So I'm always sort of like trying to find people like that. I've got a listener story that's up today that's from a woman who grew up in a trad-cath homeschool environment, but then became a church organist. And she's made her way towards a kind of generative agnosticism, but she's done that through music, but also a lot of self-work. So I love stuff like that. I'm also becoming more and more interested in this huge, unseen up until now by me world of video games, and that's happening through my kids. I started yesterday playing.
You have to know them as a depth psychologist, or if you're doing depth therapy, because Elder Scrolls and Dark Souls or whatever.
Yeah.
Those are the mythology of my patients, and those metaphors. When I was seeing a different population, I was in the hospital. I had to go out and learn Dragon Ball Z because that was the way that a lot of inner city African American children wanted to talk about power and struggles and progress and emotion. And now it's video games. I don't.
Yeah, amazing. I mean, my 11-year-old got me to start playing Cult of the Lamb yesterday, and he got me to start playing it because I was looking over his shoulder, and I was absolutely astonished that this strange little production company from Australia had created an incredibly funny but also accurate game depicting the formation of a cult. And if anybody's out there who is a video game journalist who knows about how to contextualize this, I'd love to talk to them. But my question for the 11-year-old was, I'm 52 and I've spent 20 years involved in cult analysis and discourse. And I'm wondering whether you at 11 playing this game for a few months would give you a kind of would give you a kind of inoculation against these forces. Like, it's all out on the open. Like, what the leader is you as the leader are going to indoctrinate, you're going to gather devotion, you're going to issue new doctrines, you're going to preach sermons, you're going to figure out how to balance the exploitation of your followers against feeding them. It puts you into the incredibly funny position of being a little tiny lamb cult leader, and it just occurred to me, like, I've been talking for 20 years to boomers about how to solve the problem of cults. And what might be more effective is to figure out how to make the influence mongering both identifiable, accessible, and funny. Yeah. And it's just blowing my mind to think about that, right? It's like, what have I been doing all of this time? Sort of spinning my wheels in a kind of paranoid recreation of what cultic dynamics are. When here are these like Gen Z kids who are putting together this gorgeous, hilarious, very accurate depiction of cultic life in a way that if it takes off, it's like, who would actually walk into an environment like I did when I was, 29 years old and get sucked in by somebody like Michael Roach? It would be transparent. It would be
humor is so
transparent.
incredibly important. I mean, that's a ton of, I think, what makes this show, it's the kind of love it or hate it, is that I want this to be funny, because I think that humor is like one of those things that can, and because you never get humor in a vacuum, like if you meet a real narcissist, like they can't be funny, like they'll make jokes, but it's just a power play of like, well, I'm better than her, or she's bad, or but like humor is this way of like when you get little, that you need, and that's why it's associated with outgroups so much of the time. I think that you need somebody to get something about you, or see something, or accept something about you that they don't want. So you got to put that thing in gift wrap with a metaphor or a painting or a witticism, And I think that reaches people in a way that they hear it, and they experience it through.
Yeah, humor. And then they relax, and there's more generosity, right? Good. All right. Well, I'm glad that you do that. I'll look forward to hanging out with you again. Thanks, Joel.
Thank you so much, Matthew. I appreciate you coming on.
Romance, drink yourself sober. Till the algorithms kill. Answer back, surrenderers, feed your blind spots grow.